Hello everyone and welcome again to Practical Inclusion. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I broadcast from today, which is the land of the Wadawurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that may be watching with us live today or may tune into the replay over the next week or so. Shamila, Nivy, whose lands do you come to us from today?
Thanks so much, Bree. So Shamila and I are on the lands of the people of the Kulin Nation, and the lands that we're on at the moment have not yet been, decided upon between the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people, and that process, I believe, is ongoing at the moment. So we're on the lands of the people of the Kulin Nation.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Now, today I asked these two incredible professionals to come on with me, and I was so amazed that they said yes. Not only because they now have an outstanding podcast that I've been binge listening to all the episodes that they've released so far called Unapologetically Brown, and we'll talk a bit about that later. It is an incredible podcast for us to all start listening to, but also because, quite frankly, cultural diversity and anti-racism in the workplace is an area that I certainly, as a D&I professional, find the most difficult. I don't think just because I'm white. I think it's also because of a lack of education and understanding from me that I'm trying desperately to work on, but also because of the complexity of the issue in the workplace. And you know, that cultural diversity isn't one thing. We know that this is an incredibly complex issue that we need to tackle. And I don't think across the diversity and inclusion circles in Australia that we're tackling it well at all. So I'm really grateful for these two for coming on today and sharing their lived experience and their wisdom with us on this topic. So what I want to do first, if Shamila and Nivy, if you could tell us a bit about your stories, give us a little snapshot into your lives and what kind of drove you to create this podcast and why now?
I can go first, Niv. I personally think it was quite serendipitous that Nivy and I met, and how our very first encounter with each other was bathed in an experience of an older white man and his racist comments to both of us, which we obviously talk about in our first episode. And I think right after that encounter, we both looked at each other and we were like, Jesus, is this still happening in 2020? And then we realized that we've had so many similar experiences in the past, right? In the very same situation, the very same kind of conversations, just being women and specifically women of color. I think for me personally, I've always been quite vocal about injustice, especially from a gender and race standpoint of view. I come from a media background, with CNN and several other global media companies that I worked for. But fundamentally, it's coming from a very own personal experience, having lived, in multiple regions, multiple countries, traveled extensively. And I still realize that racism does not discriminate by country or region. It's present everywhere. And I think, me and Niv both realized we shared the same sentiment, and she'll tell you obviously a little bit about herself, and we wanted to address these issues and delve into these issues of external as well as internalized sexism and racism in our communities. So, yeah.
Thanks, Shamila, and thanks so much, Bree, for having us on. It's an absolute pleasure. I think for us, we wanted to create Unapologetically Brown for a couple of reasons. And one is reflective of my own experience, and that's being a second-generation Australian born to Indian Hindu parents here in Victoria. And growing up, I think, in a country that was still coming to terms with what it meant to be multicultural and the impact that had on the psyche and has had on the psyche of, hundreds and thousands of people like me from many different cultural backgrounds, and trying to unpack, that impact of assimilation, trying to unpack what does it mean to be a person of color in a country that, was formed, I guess, on a legacy of such violence against our First Nations people, and what's our role as the people in between, I suppose, of the next group of people that have come to the country. So what's our role here? How have we internalized racism in many respects? And what does it mean to be a person of colour in a country as diverse as Australia with such a complex history? So part of what we're trying to do on the platform of Unapologetically Brown is to look at those second generation, third gen experiences of what it means to be a person of colour in Australia. We do focus a lot on the South Asian community, but not exclusively. It was just that in that community we recognise that we have actually internalised a lot of racism, whether due to the norms back in our ancestral home countries or, the experience of being a person of colour in Australia. And how do you move through that? And add, I suppose, to the broader conversation on culture, identity, race and politics in Australia, which is an ever-growing sphere. And it's still a sphere that we very well know. There aren't that many minority voices. There are some really great ones. And, we thought to ourselves, well, we're people with lived experience, but also professional knowledge and understanding in these areas. And we wanted to put our thoughts out there and also to find like-minded people such as yourself, people of colour and other allies who want to kind of unpack and learn the same things that we do, and maybe we can try and do it together.
Yeah, and I think that's what's drawn me so much to your podcast, is that I don't see a lot of these conversations happening, and it is hard to find them. We know we're getting inundated with LinkedIn events and all kinds of events on women and the gender equity pay gap, but we're not seeing enough of these discussions about race and cultural diversity. So yeah, well done. When we chatted earlier, we spoke a little bit about, when I listened to the first episode you had, and you talk about that White Australia policy, and I guess the flow-on effects of that, even in today's workplaces, and particularly around, you use the term casual racism. Can either of you elaborate on that and try and set the scene, perhaps, for those of us who don't really understand what that's like in Australian workplaces now, or how it plays out?
Sure. Well, I think the first part of your question about, I suppose, assimilation and the White Australia policy and what are its impacts, that's something. So I think for me, and I am speaking generally, and of course there are going to be exceptions to what I say, but I think even though we have a policy of multiculturalism that defines our immigration, that it's no longer exclusionary based on region of origin, it doesn't mean that. What does it mean to actually have a country that's multicultural by identity? And that's, I think, the dialogue of what it means to be Australian is very limited, to be honest, about whose values shape that conversation. And in the workplace, it translates to the pressure that people from different cultural backgrounds feel to kind of abandon their culture in order to fit in. And that's something that we learn at school. It's something that we learn throughout our professional careers, that you will be punished to the extent to which you're different from the cultural norm, and that you're encouraged as much as you can to chip those parts of your different cultural identity away from you. So I think that's what we're seeing. So as as professionals who've had between us 30 plus years of experience in the workplace, seeing what those impacts are. So we talk about policy, we talk about history, but then how does that play out in the workplace? That's what we're newly starting to uncover, is that expressing your cultural diversity at work, it, as a person who identifies with different cultural backgrounds, is not so easy, because there's a lot of pressure on us to just be quote unquote Australian. And that's what we mean about those unsaid pressures. And it's something that we unpack in our episode around name shame as well. It's about the ways in which we've been taught to hate those aspects of our cultural identity that make us, non-Anglo-Australian. And in the workplace, and Shamila will talk about those examples at work, but Australian workplaces, when it comes to cultural diversity, are still very focused on food and festival multiculturalism, just like a lot of this country is. So the things at work, we talk about Harmony Day on the 21st of March. Now, Harmony Day is actually UN International Day of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. But in Australia, we call it Harmony Day. And for many of us, it's about, bringing samosa or pierogi or pho into the workplace. And it's like, is that really what we still mean by cultural diversity? That's what people still think it is. But what it is in the workplace is about a lack of equal opportunity when it comes to career promotion, biases in recruitment, And then, of course, there are those experiences at work, like casual racism.
Yeah, and just following on from what Nivy has said, I think she hit the nail on the head, which is, I think employers or employees today are told to assimilate. That's what we're told, right? So if you do this, if you lean in, if you change your hair, your accent, your clothes, your tone of voice, be more Australian, you might have a better chance of succeeding. So, and that itself is essentially the problem, because the workplace is structured to benefit predominantly specific segments of people, right? And in this case, let's be honest, it's white, mainly males, to succeed. So the belief that there is meritocracy, where the cream rises to the top, is actually irrelevant. You can't use that statement anymore. And I've heard this so many times, not just in Australia, but in so many other places around the world. So what that says to people of multicultural backgrounds or people of color is that if you work hard enough, then you can rise to the top. And that relates back to us as we are less than, or we are not as qualified as. That's why we have not succeeded. So the problem here is the system has been structured in a way to support specific groups of people. And these groups of people are the ones that, if you learn how they talk, how they compete with each other, the culture they put together, and if these mechanisms and structures are still put in place and not stripped away, then it'll be really hard for everyone else who is not like them to succeed. So I think that's a key thing in what needs to happen. And that's how you encounter casual racism, because it's a breeding ground, right? And there's nothing casual about casual racism, really. It's for the people who experience it, it's actually pretty full on. So things like, like what Nip says, like how many days that all bring our different food and celebrate, and this is the significance of us having cultural diversity. And then someone will come up and say, "Oh wow, your food you must love spicy food because you're Indian or you're South American, or your English is so good." And I actually had someone say that to me, which was shocking. I mean, they were like, "Oh my God, you speak such good English." I was like, "Yes, this is what we speak at home." But I mean, it's things like that. It's like the microaggressions that come into play that are not being conscious. I mean, people are not being conscious of it, especially workplaces. And this is top down, right? Hence why the unconscious bias that kicks in.
Yeah. And just to add on to what Shamila was saying there, is that the point that you raised there about, I guess, in the workplace, like the casual racism does happen a lot, right? And the difference between interpersonal racism and then structural racism, there is a difference between the two. So on one hand, we're dealing with, the microaggressions every day, which is a poverty of expectations, or ethnic zoning, so expecting people of certain cultural backgrounds to be naturally good at accounting or engineering, but less good at leadership. These kind of stereotypes we have of people based on their cultural background, I think is problematic. I think also, for example, in the workplace, when we look at leadership, there's a lot of studies that have shown that Australia really is not doing well when it comes to representative leadership. So leadership of our companies, of our government, parliament, university boards, etc., are not representative of the diversity of the Australian community. And it's not because people don't have the skills. They are as educated, they're as qualified, they're actually overqualified in many respects. It's just that there's something else going on, and much more than casual racism.
And so, God, there's just so much to unpick in there. And what you've articulated really is what I found the biggest struggle kind of leading some of the diversity and inclusion work in an organisation. Because what, typically we see is that we have in large organisations who are serious about diversity and inclusion, they have a gender equity plan, they have an LGBTI inclusion plan, they probably have a cultural diversity plan that, as you say, is mostly based around events and celebrating days and perhaps training. And we'll have a disability access inclusion plan. But I feel by doing that, organisations are missing the opportunity. So what they do is they do their gender equity plan and it focuses on bias in recruitment, and the whole conversation is about gender. When bias in recruitment exists across the spheres that we're talking about here. And so I love that you've brought that to the fore, because I know my experience and the experience with others is that when you raise that discussion around how do we make the recruitment process more inclusive for people of diverse cultural backgrounds, people get scared about collecting data, for starters, get incredibly scared about targets and how would you set one, what would it look like? Aren't we being racist by doing that? The conversation gets derailed so quickly that it just gets put in a too hard basket. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. All of the points that you raise are extremely valid, and you've hit the nail on the head, is that we tend to think about diversity and inclusion in a very compartmentalized approach, and that's still reflective of a very compliance-based mentality when it comes to inclusion and diversity. It means that people of intersectional identities really fall through the cracks. So, women of colour, a woman with a disability, an Aboriginal woman, we're not picking them up, right, because of the way we set up these systems. It's difficult. It's hard to do it, but you understand why organisations take that approach in many respects. And so legislatively, that's the way it's set up. The groups are separated out, if you like. And the question around data is really interesting. It's so, for example, we have, some data on gender, but we're looking at, the man-woman gender binaries. That was the data that we have. And so it's easier to take action on what we have data for. Whereas when you look at, LGBTIQ identity, or people disclosing whether or not they have a disability or what their cultural background is, that information can be collected, but is there trust within that organisation to collect that data? What are you going to do with it? Because if you're collecting data and you're not doing anything with it, you're just creating a lot of disengagement and mistrust. So, data is often brought up as oh, we don't want to do this, we don't want to collect data, but it means that also we can't really hold ourselves accountable. And it is true, there's always going to be some vexing issues when it comes to data. How do you classify? For example, I really don't like the term culturally and linguistically diverse. I think it's not very helpful. And, that's one point. And you might make that argument about, other groups where there's so much diversity, like, LGBTIQ, look at the diversity just in that, cohort in that community as well. So it can be difficult, but it's about finding categories that matter to people that at least give us that starting point to understand the lay of the land. And if you're wondering about targets, well, what's happening in the community? That's the way the Victorian government goes about it, for example. It's what we set targets based on community representation. That's just a pretty simple way to do it. It's what we do with gender, at least on the way it's talked about at the moment. And that we take for other groups as well.
Great. Shamila, did you have anything to add to that point?
No, I think Nivy pretty much summed it up pretty well. I also think that a lot of organizations tend to, just go through the motions of needing to do what is the basics in order to fulfill that tick box on culture, diversity, inclusion. And I hate to say, but it's when you talk about diversity and inclusion, the subject matter is so focused around gender that the other, the challenges that other minority groups have are not taken into account as much. And I don't know, I'll be honest with you, I don't know whether that's based on it's too hard to do because we're still focused on trying to get the gender equilibrium up to a certain standard. But I think it needs to be done simultaneously, because if you look at gender and you look at someone like me, who is a woman of color, then that gender equation is not enough. There are other challenges that I would experience in any, whether it be public or private sectors, or even as an entrepreneur that I am in, that need to be addressed in order to create that equality that equates to equity.
Love it. Yeah, and it's certainly, something that people have heard me talk about on this show previously. The fact, and I know when I very first entered diversity and inclusion work, as somebody who had been working in the gender equity space for a long time said to me, when we get it right for women, we'll get it right for everybody. And I bought into that. And I learned quickly that was ridiculous. And no, if we get it right for a queer Aboriginal woman with a disability, then we might be closer to getting it right for everybody. Ridiculous to think otherwise. So yeah, I really love that. Now, what I wanted to kind of shift us to is, and not really shift because we've been talking quite practically about what people can do, but thinking about let's recognise that currently most diversity and inclusion practitioners in this country are white women, and this can be a challenging space for people to work in, coming from that position. What would be your message to a white woman who's leading diversity and inclusion, or a HR manager who's kind of got responsibility for this? What would be your words of advice or wisdom to them working in the anti-racism or cultural diversity space?
I'm sorry that I don't have like answers in that respect. I'll come to, but I would be remiss not to point out some of the structural issues here. It's that HR, diversity inclusion professionals, will be doing their best, but inclusion and diversity is vastly under-resourced and underestimated in organisations. So if you have one person at the officer level who's, let's be honest, probably job sharing the I&D function with some other HR function as well, there's beyond celebration of days, which is only to make a company look good and it's got very little to do with their staff's well-being and actual social justice. It's almost a waste of time, other than it's a PR exercise. So I think when an organisation is really just trying to start the ball rolling and is thinking about compliance, they're very focused on events. And events without substance, I'm really just not a fan of that. I think we need to really focus on shifting attitudes and raising awareness. And we're still talking, that very early stages of your inclusion maturity model. I think that there has to be executive accountability when it comes to inclusion and diversity. It's the easiest thing in the world to handball it off to someone who's, wearing 10 different hats and expect them to, ward off every lawsuit, because that's really what we're talking about. We're seeing, people of colour or people of diverse gender identities or abilities as just a lawsuit waiting to happen, and we need to tick the box and lodge the plan so that we don't get into trouble, and we can say that we've done the bare minimum. So I think in many ways inclusion and diversity practitioners are set up in such a way that it's going to be very difficult for them to succeed. But I would also just caution, I know that, for example, a lot of organisations are small to medium enterprises who are doing this work, and, it would be a little bit tone deaf, just to put it mildly, if you're like a white HR professional trying to lead some conversations on cultural diversity or racial justice. I think where possible, bring in people with that expertise. And I know it's hard, we don't live in a world with a money tree in our backyards, but from an organisational perspective, if you're really serious about this, you need to put your money where your mouth is, and executives need to take responsibility and stop handballing this off to someone who doesn't really have the power but is stuck with all of the responsibility. So I think if I can just frame it like that, I think the over-reliance on events needs to you need to really review that. Usually staff are pretty savvy, that they know disingenuous inclusion, so, but for some people they're still very happy with events, and I just don't think events are enough anymore when we're talking about the injustices in the world and the interpersonal, like our own attitudes and values, as well as the structural systemic issues that, painting Racial Discrimination Day and calling it Harmony Day, I don't think is good. But if you are an HR professional, I know that probably anything that I've said is not very comforting, and I am sorry about that. I don't mean to, be offensive or upset people in that regard, but probably looking to bring in and make the case for bringing in support if you're really serious about this, but also try not to be very tokenistic in this regard. So if you're really going to do something about this, it's a journey. It's not, we'll fix it tomorrow, or, we saw the horrible death of George Floyd, and say, well, now let's have a conversation on race if there's not psychological safety in the workplace, if there's not organisational commitment to listening, because the reality is for people of colour in Australia, we've been gaslit on our experiences of racism, I think, until 2020. We weren't allowed to bring it up. If we said we experienced racism, someone else would say, no, you didn't. That wasn't racist. they're the police, and our own lived experience is not valued. And if you ask Aboriginal or First Nations people, their experiences, it's very different and much worse in that regard. The structural and intergenerational violence and oppression and systemic discrimination, that's a different form of racism than what's facing people who've come here, post World War II or after the abolishment of the White Australia policy. So I think coming back to linking up with those who have expertise if possible. So if you're in a regional rural area, look at your community organisations, see what's happening there, see if there are people you might be able to bring in to value their expertise and hear their stories. It depends on where you are, I suppose, in your journey. If you're starting from day dot, I think bringing in someone with a bit of expertise who's going to help you with the roadmap, but really linking it to your broader organisational goals so that it's not tokenistic would be just some steps to consider.
Fantastic. Shamila, did you want to add anything to that?
I guess my only, I would basically say that even before doing things within the organization, within the community, within your employees, the fundamentals need to start with, you need to remove recruitment racism. I think that's itself is a hurdle for a lot of employees or just multicultural people as a sense. I mean, I've experienced it as well personally when I got here. I think this racial bias is often quite explicit and it's not really unconscious. I mean, there's it's bias against a person's name, how they look, their accents, as we mentioned earlier. I mean, there's even studies that have been found that if someone having a Chinese name or a Middle Eastern name, they have to actually apply for a job 64% more times, respectively, as opposed to an Anglo-Saxon person. And this is actual data that's come through, right? And and a person with an Anglo name is 3 times more likely to be invited for an interview compared to someone with a non-Anglo name. So I think this itself is where you need to start. You need to start bringing in people with different backgrounds, different cultural beliefs, different expertise in order to really be committed to enhancing cultural diversity and inclusion in your organization. If it stops even at the recruitment stage, then how are you even addressing this in the first place? That's just puzzling in itself. So I think for me, that's what I would say. And I think Australia needs this. They need the diversity. It needs representation of who Australia is, number one. And number two is we live in a global economy. When you have a diversity of ideas, capabilities, cultural intelligence, it's how you navigate the new world, and now even more so, right? If they don't accept that and accept the natural progression of our multiculturalism, then how are we going to move towards a more sustainable cultural economy or social well-being? So I think it is an ecosystem that needs to be created in order to create that across the country, and it stems into all areas, not just the workplace, because this is where it starts, but then it stems into the political sense of it, the social sense, the economical sense, and all around, and it projects who we are to the world, and that's really important.
Right.
Yeah.
If we're rolling in the tip there, I think, Bree, you'd asked us for one tip, and I think Shamila's really hit the nail on the head there. Recruitment's a big issue. There's a lot of bias in recruitment. But just to add to that, Australian workforces are diverse already, but the problem is they're not diverse in leadership. So Australia has this, people of all different cultural backgrounds, whether they were born here or came here as professional skilled migrants or studied here and went into the workplace. Australia is full of a diverse workforce, but they're at the entry and mid-level. So it's not as much as we are worrying about recruitment opportunities, and that is important and continues to be important. It's also about retention, promotion, and development opportunities. So how can we inject more transparency into who we're deciding to give that secondment to, or that higher duties to, or that promotion opportunity to? And how do we inject more transparency into that process? How do we have bias-aware systems and also bias-aware leadership? Because we translate those interpersonal biases translate into systemic biases, and they affect our recruitment, retention, promotion, development opportunities. And that's the kind of pipeline. We need to see those pipeline of opportunities for all people in an organization, when right now it's only for a few. So those would just be some we'd like people to consider as well, not just the interpersonal attitude, but also those structural organizational systems as well.
Yeah, fantastic. We've run out of time, but in a quick kind of summation there of all that rich information and advice that you've given us, what I've highlighted here is recruitment, representation in leadership, shifting focus away from events and onto the structure and systems that are continuing to perpetuate privilege and present barriers to people, is really what I've kind of summarised there as some key takeaways for people from this session. Please tune in to the podcast, Unapologetically Brown. You can find it on podcast, I believe it's called, and we'll post the link for you. You will be able to share this video later on. By tonight. It'll have captions associated with it, and it'll be on my YouTube channel, so that if people want to share from there with the captions, that would be great. Please continue to add your comments. It's been fantastic to see the conversation that people are having about this and the topics that have been raised. Thank you so much to both of you for coming on today, and if I can, I'll squeeze you back on at another time, because I'd love to continue the conversation. It's been fantastic. And to all those listening live and on the replay, again, be back again next Tuesday. Thank you so much for your support and for tuning in, and as always, send through ideas for topics and for guests, and we'll keep rolling through them. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us, Bree. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.